One moment I was walking down a crowded boardwalk and the next there was only the biting cold and the taste of salt. I hit the water hard, plunging beneath the surface flailing like a cat dropped in a washing machine. A glowing blue text box suddenly dominated my vision, completely unaffected by the water stinging my eyes. Welcome to Saltwater World. Status: Oceanic Designation. System Directive: you are now on a world of endless ocean. Your old life is gone. To survive here you must explore, collect materials, craft equipment, and upgrade your base. Warning: there are no respawns. Death is permanent. The tutorial phase begins now. You have 12 hours of newbie protection. Good luck, Kalen. I burst to the surface, gasping for air. What the hell? I sputtered, thrashing against the heavy swells. A parallel Earth? A tutorial? My brain couldn't process the glowing words still lingering in the corner of my vision like a burned-in screen. I struggled against the current until my hand slammed into cold metal. I hauled my exhausted body out of the waves, soaked as a tea bag on its third use, and collapsed onto a single, rusted hexagonal platform of corrugated iron. Tutorial Objective 1 complete. Survive initial insertion. Tip: scavenge floating debris to acquire basic crafting materials. I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, shivering in my soaked t-shirt and gray board shorts. Then a new icon pinged in the lower left corner of my vision, a tiny speech bubble. Current survivors, 14,000. I focused on the icon and a translucent chat window expanded across my sight. The chat absolutely exploded after that welcome announcement. Text scrolled by so fast it was a blur of pure panic. I wasn't alone. Thousands of people had just been dropped into this watery hell. One guy going by the name Landlover99 just kept screaming in all caps, "Where is the dirt? I can't swim, someone call 911. Another user, Saravi, said, "I just spawned on top of a floating piece of trash. Something massive is bumping it from below. Help." It was chaos, desperation. People were drowning, freezing, or realizing they were completely stranded in an endless ocean. But as I watched the text fly by, I noticed a second tab pulse next to the chat window. I mentally clicked it and a new interface slid into view. Notice: all exchanges are instantly system teleported to your location. 0% transaction fee during tutorial phase. People were already trying to barter for survival. The offers were as desperate as the chat. Offer 1 wet designer shoe, request fresh water. Offer my Rolex, request a piece of wood big enough to float on. Nobody wanted Rolexes here. The currency of this world wasn't money anymore, it was buoyancy and fresh water. Before the panic could fully set in, a massive, glowing double roulette wheel materialized in my HUD, temporarily blocking the chat. The inner ring displayed survival gear, while the outer ring showed silhouettes of watercraft, some glowing a legendary gold with images of high-end explorer vessels, others glowing epic purple with heavy-duty commercial dry suits. Both wheels spun in my vision with a rapid mechanical clicking. The inner wheel slowed first, ticking past a professional commercial rebreather and landing with a pathetic clack on a dull gray sliver. A small box materialized in the air and dropped heavily onto the rusted metal deck. Durability, 45-100. The outer wheel continued to spin. I held my breath, watching a sleek motorized skiff blur past. It slowed to a crawl, agonizingly ticking past a solid wooden raft, before stopping on another dull gray sliver. A pathetic plop sounded as my second reward materialized and dropped directly onto the rusted metal deck beside my knee. Buoyancy rating, terrible. I stared at the flimsy ring of rubber, looking about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. A heavy ocean swell crashed against the side of the structure, showering us in freezing spray. There was no way that cheap ring of air could handle these waves, let alone protect me from whatever was bumping into the trash out there. The rusted iron platform I was sitting on was cold and hard, but it was anchored to a submerged structure deep below. It wasn't a system-recognized base, just a dead piece of pre-collapse metal, but for now it was my only real sanctuary. I kicked the inner tube toward the center of the grate so it wouldn't blow away. I wasn't going anywhere on that thing. Survival in the blue graveyard was about sheer willpower. A cluster of debris had caught on a jagged piece of submerged concrete about 10 feet below my platform. Tangled in a thick mass of glowing kelp was a wooden supply crate. I slipped the cheap goggles over my eyes and bit down on the plastic mouthpiece of the snorkel. I took a massive gulp of air and plunged beneath the surface. The ocean was colder than a pawnbroker's heart. At first there was no helpful timer, just the crushing weight of the ocean and the screaming instinct of my body to breathe. I kicked my legs frantically, swimming down toward the kelp. Without fins, my progress was agonizingly slow. By the time I reached the debris field, my lungs were already burning. I grabbed the wooden crate, but it was anchored by heavy wire. I tugged, but it didn't budge. Panic began to claw at my chest. Black spots danced in my peripheral vision. My body was begging me to open my mouth and inhale. Instead of retreating, I pushed past the breaking point, stubbornly reaching into the tangle for a piece of rusted rebar and a loose coil of high-tension wire. As I forced my body to endure the oxygen deprivation, a flashing warning box finally flared in my sight. 12 seconds. I let go of the crate, clutching the loose rebar and wire to my chest, and kicked off the concrete with everything I had. The red counter ticked down in my vision, mocking me. 10:85. I broke the water at 2 seconds, ripping the snorkel out of my mouth and gasping violently for air, my vision swimming with black spots. "Thanks for the warning," I wheezed, coughing up a mouthful of seawater. I spent the next 3 hours shivering on my platform, shaking like a dog passing a peach pit as I meticulously wove the scavenged wire around the rusted rebar to create a makeshift grappling hook. My hands were bleeding, but I couldn't afford to care. If I had to dive for every scrap, I would drown before sunset. I stood up, spinning the heavy iron hook in a tight vertical arc. With a grunt of effort, I launched it at the surface debris. The cable uncoiled, hissing through the salty air. Clang! The sharp teeth of the rebar bit deep into the waterlogged crate I had abandoned earlier. I hauled the heavy find foot by agonizing foot toward my fragile sanctuary. I smashed the crate open with my heel. Inside was a pile of wet nylon webbing, a torn, sleeveless black neoprene vest, and a blueprint schematic rendered in simple line art. Requirements: 1 high-pressure scuba tank, 10 iron scrap nylon webbing. I looked down through the grated floor of my platform. Deep beneath my feet, the dark shadows of ancient skyscrapers stretched upward like tombstones. The real loot was down there, but to reach it, I needed a high-pressure scuba tank to complete the blueprint and 5 more pieces of iron scrap, and the sun was already setting. Night fell over the ocean like a wet, heavy blanket. I sat on the edge of the grated iron, my hands slick with blood from weaving the wire. The drops fell through the grates, pinging softly into the dark water below. I didn't hear it coming. The water exploded. A torpedo of muscle launched out of the blackness, crashing onto the platform. It was an 80-pound barracuda. Its jaws clamped onto my thigh like a starving pit bull on a pork chop. I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat as the beast violently thrashed, trying to drag me into the water. My vision immediately tunneled, the edges bleeding into a blackness. I couldn't feel my left leg anymore, only an icy numbness radiating up my spine. My pulse pounded in my ears, an erratic flutter. I was losing blood fast. I was dying on day 1, talk about a case of the Mondays. My fingers scrambled across the wet iron, blindly finding the rusted rebar hook. As the fish jerked backward, pulling me an inch from the water's edge, I drove the heavy iron spike directly down through its eye. The beast convulsed wildly, its jaws snapping open before it slumped heavily onto the iron deck dead. I collapsed onto my back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I was incredibly pale, the world spinning in nauseating circles. Then the system flared. Instead of just vanishing entirely, the dead fish broke down into a flurry of blue pixels, leaving behind a neat pile of harvested resources. And a glowing first kill reward chest. I tried to reach for it, but my arm wouldn't obey. The cold numbness had reached my chest. I needed a coagulant to stop the bleeding, and I needed it now. I dragged my blood-slicked hand across the iron, my fingertips popping the latch on the reward chest. I grabbed the spray with a trembling hand, emptying the foam directly onto my torn thigh. The bleeding stopped instantly, a searing heat replacing the cold numbness as my vision slowly stabilized. I leaned my head back against the iron grate, my chest heaving, and looked at the glowing skill description that integrated directly into my visual interface. Skill description: desperation. The system favors survivors. When the host is pushed to the absolute brink of failure, this skill triggers, identifying your greatest immediate need and applying a massive temporary surge to the required attribute. Beside my leg, the heavy steel scuba tank gleamed in the moonlight. It was the exact missing component I needed for my harness blueprint. Combined with the 5 iron scrap from the first crate and the 5 from this chest, I finally had the 10 scrap required to breathe underwater. Before I could celebrate, the HUD flashed a brilliant, blinding gold. A message projected itself not just to me, but to all 14,000 survivors in my region. The chat window in my peripheral vision absolutely lost its mind. User Blade, a kill? What did he kill? Land Lover 99, there are monsters in the water. User 8812, difficulty scaling. Kalen, you idiot, what did you do? Saravi, please Kalen, how did you fight it? I have nothing but an inner tube. I dismissed the chat window, completely exhausted. I hadn't just survived the night, I had earned the depths. By the time the sun breached the horizon on my second day, the boy who had shivered in a wet t-shirt was gone. I spent the early morning shivering as the wind whipped across the platform. Working quickly, I pulled on the torn, sleeveless black neoprene vest I'd scavenged the day before. Then I combined the newly acquired high-pressure tank with the nylon webbing, the 10 iron scrap, and the blueprint. The parts merged in a wash of pixelated light, forming a heavy mechanical regulator attached to a rugged strap-on tank harness. I slung the heavy straps over my shoulders, the cold metal of the tank pressing firmly against the thin neoprene, and locked the buckle tightly. I took a deep breath and a rush of crisp, compressed air flooded my lungs. I gasped in relief, letting the cool air steady my heart rate. It tasted a bit like sucking on a rubber tailpipe, but it was oxygen. Reaching into my pile of scavenged debris, I fashioned a heavy Velcro strap and secured a rugged underwater flashlight directly to my left forearm. This would keep my hands completely free. My gear was pathetic, but it would have to be enough. My fresh water was running low, and I needed to find high-tier tradable loot. The only place to find that was in the silent ruins of the forgotten civilization below. I tipped backward off the platform. The chaotic wind of the surface vanished instantly, replaced by the profound, crushing silence of the ocean and an agonizing, biting cold. Even with the neoprene vest protecting my core, the descent was brutal without a full wetsuit or fins. As I got deeper, the freezing water bit into my bare arms and legs, hitting me like a freight train made of ice. The cold acted like a physical weight that threatened to seize my muscles. The heavy steel tank dragged me down faster than I wanted, and I had to kick frantically with my bare feet just to control my momentum. I aimed for a flooded corporate skyscraper, swimming about 100 feet down until my lungs burned from the cold air of the regulator. I dragged myself through the shattered glass facade of the 20th floor, the edges scraping against my exposed skin. The flashlight strapped to my arm sliced through the darkness, illuminating a surreal, frozen world, a forest of floating office chairs, desks anchored by heavy desktop monitors, and reams of moldy, drifting paper. Then a sudden flicker of intense violet light caught my eye from the deepest corner of the floor. Embedded inside the mangled drawers of a rusted steel filing cabinet was a heavy, cylindrical metallic module, glowing with a faint, steady status indicator, an industrial system core. These power modules were the literal lifeblood of the saltwater system. Shivering violently, I reached out and wrapped both hands firmly around the cold, heavy cylinder. Warning: harvesting releases localized energy spike. When I broke the surface of the water, my teeth chattering uncontrollably like a skeleton sitting on a washing machine, the system absolutely lost its mind. A blinding crimson and gold notification shattered across the sky above me, accompanied by an alarm that sounded like a dying foghorn. "Well, that can't be good," I muttered around my regulator, clutching the heavy core tightly against my chest. That's when I realized my localized energy spike had drawn company. A heavily modified iron tugboat had drifted silently into my designated region. Its hull was a patchwork of reinforced steel plates, bristling with jagged scrap iron bumpers. Standing on the elevated bow of the vessel was a woman with deep bronze skin and a long, thick silver braid falling over her shoulder. She looked like a sunrise in May after a rainstorm. It hit me like a double rainbow. She was wearing a form-fitting, navy blue tactical dive suit layered with bright silver armor plating. She had the kind of curves that could make a man completely forget his own name, wrapped in a neoprene suit that was blatantly defying the laws of physics. Logically, a combat-grade dive suit shouldn't be able to hold up like that, clinging to her like a second skin, while simultaneously supporting heavy metal shoulder pads and thigh plates without tearing under the tension. It was structurally impossible, but I wasn't exactly in a position to argue with the system's engineering. But any momentary distraction I might have felt about the structural integrity of her front zipper was instantly vaporized when I looked at her face. She had high, sculpted cheekbones and a sharp, elegant jawline that looked like it could cut glass. Her piercing blue eyes were so intense, so ruthlessly sharp, that they made me want to find a dark corner and cower in it. She looked like a gorgeous, incredibly dangerous sunrise. A sunrise that was currently pointing a massive steel pneumatic spear gun right at my chest. The spear gun's valve whistled softly, and her eyes were narrowed to sharp slits, completely locked onto the glowing core in my hand. A notification pinged in the corner of my vision. "That's an industrial core you've got there, Scavenger," Sola's voice crackled through a weatherproof loudhailer mounted to her boat's deck. I didn't drop the metal cylinder. I pulled myself out of the water onto my platform, the wind biting at my exposed arms and legs as I stood my ground. My HUD flashed red alerts. The silence stretched. Then Sola smirked, letting out a short laugh of disbelief that hit me with a double dose of pure condescension, and lowered the heavy spear gun. "Relax, kid," she said, her tone shifting to a pragmatic drawl. "I tracked your energy spike the second you popped your tutorial bubble. But you dive remarkably deep for a rookie in board shorts." I glared up at her, my skin covered in goosebumps. "How do you have a reinforced iron tugboat on day 2? She raised a silver eyebrow. "Day 2, kid, I dropped in wave 112 over a month ago. The system pulls from parallel Earths whenever it feels like it, staggering the drops. You just merged your region with the open waters, which means you're swimming with the big fish now." She tapped her boot against the metal railing. "My main engine is failing. Help me retrieve heavy propulsion parts from a submerged research lab on the 40th floor of a tower nearby, and I won't have to take that core from your cold, dead hands." "Deal." Sola leaped onto my platform with a heavy thud. She stepped into my space and shoved a rugged, thick-cased marine GPS tablet directly against my chest, tapping the screen to display a detailed, high-contrast sonar map of the local topography. "The pre-collapse Naval Research Lab is buried in the center of that tower," Sola explained, her voice all business. "The parts I need are locked in a reinforced test vault." She looked up, her blue eyes piercing through me. "My boat has the heavy lift bags to haul it up, but the laboratory's manual backup generator is completely drained. Your core has the high-capacity power cell required to boot up the electronic locks. We go down together or we both stall out. What's it going to be?" The descent was a journey into a nightmare. We swam side by side into the ink-black water, entering the corporate tower and navigating through the labyrinth of flooded corridors. The cold was an agonizing, constant pressure against my exposed skin, making my muscles feel tighter than a drum skin at a rock concert. But I forced my bare legs to keep kicking. Without radio comms, the silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic hiss of our regulators. We were tethered to Sola's floating boat by a thick, yellow, heavy-duty commercial diving umbilical that served as our only lifeline to the surface. I swam forward, holding the heavy industrial core in both hands, while the flashlight strapped to my arm cut a pale beam into the terrifying darkness of the deep, ruined hallways. Inside the flooded laboratory vault, we found it, a massive marine diesel engine still sealed in its shipping crate. As we attached the heavy canvas salvage lift bags to the crate's anchor points, a terrifying structural groan echoed through the water. The tower was settling. A massive concrete ceiling beam cracked, collapsing directly onto my arm and pinning me against the wall. My low-air warning alarm screamed red in my HUD. I thrashed against the weight, but the concrete was unyielding. The silt from the floor swirled around us, completely blinding my vision. Sola didn't panic. Working entirely by touch in the blinding silt, she swam directly to me. Instead of trying to pull me free, she hastily strapped one of her spare canvas salvage lift bags directly to the heavy concrete beam pinning my arm. Taking her own primary regulator out of her mouth, she shoved the purge valve directly into the bottom of the canvas bag, blasting her own precious air supply into it. The massive yellow bag inflated instantly. With a violent groan, the buoyancy ripped the concrete beam upward and popped it off me like a cork from a cheap bottle of champagne. I scrambled free, clutching my bruised arm. Sola quickly shoved her regulator back in and activated the inflation valves on the main engine crate. The massive diesel block began to rise rapidly, dragging both of us upward toward the shattered windows as the lab collapsed behind us. We broke the surface just as the sun dipped below the horizon, ending my second day in this hellscape. Sola hauled me onto her deck, both of us gasping for air and my body shaking uncontrollably from the cold. The heavy engine bobbed safely in the water beside us. Instead of reaching for a wrench or a crane, Sola swiped her hand through the air, pulling up a glowing blue Vanguard Fleet command interface. She tapped a few virtual buttons, opening the ship's upgrade menu. With a flick of her wrist, she dragged the digital icons for the heavy marine engine and my industrial core directly into the ship's empty component slots. The physical engine floating in the water and the core in my hands dissolved instantly into a localized hurricane of blue and gold pixels. The swarm washed over the rusted tugboat, fusing steel and iron together in a matter of seconds. When the light faded, the Vanguard didn't just look patched, it looked formidable. The new engine hummed to life with a deep mechanical purr that I could feel in my bones. Base upgrade complete, Tier 2 engine installed. Base unlocked, the Vanguard mobile. We spent the dark hours of the night recovering on the deck, loading my scavenged materials and that pathetic inflatable inner tube aboard, and abandoning the rusted iron platform for good. When dawn finally broke on day 3, the sky was a clear, brilliant blue. The ocean was calm, the gentle morning waves lapping against the newly reinforced hull of the Vanguard, but the peace was a lie. Suddenly, the chat window I had completely ignored since popping the tutorial bubble yesterday shattered across my vision, forced open by a system emergency broadcast. It was scrolling with thousands of panicked text lines from the last 12 hours, mixing with fresh terror, and every single one of them was directed at me. Region 404 tutorial terminated early, merging with global expanse. Warning, open waters PvP and high-tier THRATS active. Landlover 99, KALN, you absolute moron, you broke the shield and my inner tube is sinking. User Blade, who sequence breaks a tutorial on day 2. Nice job ganking everyone, Kalen. Saravi, we were supposed to have a week. Curse you, Kalen, curse YOU. User 441, I hope a shark eats your toes, KAL. I blinked at the translucent screen, reading the scrolling text out loud over the calm lapping of the morning waves. Landlover 99 says I'm an absolute moron. Saravi is actively cursing my bloodline. I winced as another dozen rage-filled messages flew past. Yeah, I think they're pretty mad at me. Sola looked up from her interface, leaning against the helm with a mix of shock and dark amusement. You popped the bubble, kid. The sandbox is gone. The system just dumped all 14,000 of your people out into the open waters. But the big storm, the Crimson Gale, doesn't hit until the end of day 7, I argued, swiping away a death threat from someone named User 441. They still have 5 days to prepare for it. Yeah, but they were supposed to have 5 days to prepare in a perfectly safe nursery, Sola corrected, gesturing out at the vast, unpredictable ocean around us. Now they have to get ready for a regional hurricane while dealing with veteran players, high-tier sea monsters, and whatever else swims in the deep end. You just took away their floaties, rookie. My eyes drifted back to the chat interface, locking onto the updated status tracker hovering in the corner of my vision. Open waters chat active. Current survivors in range, 54,679. The number hit me like a physical blow. The sheer weight of what I'd done hung in the morning air, 54,000 people, 40,000 of them veterans, and I had just kicked down the only door keeping them out of our nursery. I turned away from the panicked chat logs and looked around the deck of the Vanguard. Okay. We have 5 days before the gale hits, and who knows how long before the raiders find this region. We need weapons, we need to upgrade the base. I reached out, swiping at the glowing blue fleet command interface hovering near the ship's helm. My hand passed right through the hologram, and a harsh error text flashed in my eyes. Access DENIED. You are not registered crew of this base. Hands off the dashboard, rookie, Sola warned, leaning against the steel railing. The system recognizes this tugboat as my primary base. You're just a highly profitable hitchhiker. I frowned, the ocean wind reminding me I was still wearing a wet neoprene vest. I provided the core that powered your engine. I think that buys me a little equity. Sola stared at me, her blue eyes calculating the risk. All right, I'll send the crew invite, but the system won't let you bind to the Vanguard while you still own another vessel. I don't own a vessel, I argued. She pointed to the rusted deck grating near the stern. Sitting in a sad, deflated pile was the yellow inner tube the roulette wheel had spit out on day 1. Every starter craft has a base core woven into it, Sola explained. Even that piece of garbage, you have to scrap it. To force a Tier 2 base upgrade, we need a second core to handle the processing load. I walked over to the pathetic rubber ring. I focused on it, pulling up the item prompt in my vision and mentally selected deconstruct. The inner tube hissed, instantly dissolving into a flurry of digital light. The rubber vanished, leaving behind a glowing, fist-sized sphere of pulsating white energy. Item acquired, starter ship core. I tossed the glowing orb to Sola. She slammed it directly into the center console of the fleet command interface. The system consumed it in a flash of gold. Dual-core architecture unlocked. System alert, user Sola has invited you to form a crew contract. I clicked accept, a warm light washed over the deck and my HUD expanded, syncing with the ship's sensors. I could see our fuel reserves, base integrity, and a massive upgrade menu. Welcome aboard, partner, Sola said. If we're surviving a Category 5 gale and 40,000 hostile veterans, this basic iron tugboat isn't going to cut it. We need a Tier 2 base upgrade. So what are we building? I asked. The next version of this ship, Sola replied flatly. The system needs a structural blueprint to guide the evolution, plus a mountain of raw mass to actually build it. I have a basic Tier 2 structural blueprint that will expand the ship's frame, reinforce the hull, and give us more deck space. It's the next logical step. She brought up the local sonar map, pointing to a massive, jagged shadow located 10 miles east. There's a pre-collapse naval shipyard at the bottom of a trench, Sola said, powering up the diesel engine. It's a graveyard of raw materials. It should have enough iron and steel to feed the threshold. The trench was a graveyard of giants. We dropped anchor directly over the sunken shipyard. The descent took us down into a biting cold that immediately tried to seep through my pathetic neoprene vest. When the harsh blue beam of my forearm-mounted Tier 1 lumen node finally cut through the gloom, it illuminated the rusted, skeletal remains of a pre-collapsed naval vessel. We spent the next 10 hours stripping the carcass. Sola handed me a heavy pry bar, and we went to work. Fortunately, the system made the actual harvesting clean. Once a piece of metal was completely detached from the main structure, the interface recognized it and condensed it. Steel plating X3 acquired. We loaded the condensed materials into Sola's yellow canvas lift bags and sent them rocketing toward the surface. By the time the sun began to set on day 3, my body was entirely spent. My muscles were screaming, and I was fairly certain I'd swallowed half the ocean. Sola hauled the last canvas bag over the railing of the Vanguard and dumped it into the interface. A cascade of blue light flashed across the console. That's 300 iron scrap and 50 steel plating, Sola announced. We made a massive dent. One more day of diving like that and we can trigger the upgrade. We sat on the deck and ate 4 units of the barracuda meat I'd hauled in on day 1 in silence. As I looked at the chat interface, my eyes locked onto the status tracker hovering in the corner of my vision. Open waters chat active. Current survivors in range, 54,241. 438 people died today, I whispered, the number making my stomach drop. The storm hasn't even hit yet. How did 400 people die in 12 hours? They didn't drown, Kalen, Sola said quietly, looking out at the darkening horizon. Your region barrier dropped yesterday. The hunting season started. Welcome to the open waters. That night I didn't sleep. I just laid in the bunk, scrolling through the nightly feed, staring at the chat log scroll by like a digital waterfall of misery. Some guy in Region 4 was bragging about liberating a raft, while 100 people below him were begging for anyone to tell them how to find fresh water. It was enough to make my skin crawl. I closed the tab, hoping for a dream that didn't involve drowning or sharks. Day 4 dawned gray and hostile. The ocean swells had noticeably thickened, violently rocking the Vanguard. The global timer in the corner of my vision ticked down past the 96-hour mark. We didn't waste time. We plunged back into the freezing shipyard trench to finish the grind. We needed the last of the mechanical components and copper wiring. When we finally surfaced mid-afternoon, the ocean had grown openly hostile. 4-foot swells crashed against the side of the tugboat. I hauled myself over the railing, dumping the last lift bag onto the steel grating. Sola climbed up right behind me. "Dump it in," she gasped. I transferred our entire day's inventory directly into the ship's material storage. The interface crunched the numbers against the Tier 2 blueprint. Tier 2 base upgrade requirements. X blueprint. Tier 2 structural blueprint locked. X dual-core architecture complete. X 500 iron scrap 512 500. X 100 steel plating 104 100. X 50 mechanical components 5550. X 20 copper wiring 2220 status. Upgrade ready. I looked at Sola. She wiped salt water from her eyes and flashed a grin. "Do it." I hesitated. I looked at the dark, roiling horizon and felt a sudden, sharp intuition, a survival instinct screaming that a standard Tier 2 expansion wouldn't be enough to survive the coming storm. My finger hovered over the golden icon and the system flared, identifying the extreme threat and my absolute need for a better solution. Desperation skill triggered, system override, calculating optimal survival evolution. I pressed the flashing golden upgrade base icon. The system responded with an intensity I hadn't felt before. The raw materials liquefied into a blinding, high-density cyclone of blue and gold pixels. As the light enveloped the Vanguard, I felt the tug on my own energy, as if the ship was pulling the necessity directly from my mind. The deck beneath my feet didn't just shudder, it screamed. The grinding roar of bending metal was deafening. The boat didn't just expand, it reconfigured. The hull deepened, reinforced by thick, heavy-duty plating. A massive, specialized A-frame crane began to manifest at the stern, reminiscent of a heavy-duty rescue vessel. Nestled securely in the cradle of the crane was a specialized, two-person submersible equipped with heavy-duty robotic grab arms. The transformation lasted nearly a full minute. When the light finally faded, the humble tugboat was completely unrecognizable. Base evolution complete. Rare Tier 2 submarine rescue ship, new feature unlocked. A frame launch recovery system, new feature unlocked. Two-person submersible W manipulator arms, new feature unlocked. Deep-sea stabilized hull, base integrity, 5,000. "What in the hell?" Sola whispered, staring up at the massive mechanical crane towering over the stern. She walked to the edge, looking down at the submersible cradled in the recovery rack. "This isn't a standard expansion, Kalen." I looked out at the churning, gray ocean. The ship was a fortress, and now we had the tools to dive deeper and safer than any other survivor in the open waters. "We have a shield," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. The massive A-frame crane groaned as it settled into its locked position. The grinding of metal finally ceased, leaving only the sound of 4-foot ocean swells slapping against our reinforced hull. We had a fortress, a rescue platform, and the ability to dive deeper than anyone else in the open waters. But as the adrenaline of the evolution faded, Sola slapped her hand against the new central console. "All right, the evolution is stable, but we're on a timer," Sola said, her breath pluming in the cold ocean air. "We have less than 5 days before the gale hits. I need to know exactly what we're working with, everything we have on the table." "System linked." She navigated the fleet command interface and opened a shared crew window. A holographic projection hovered between us. "Crew inventory, pooled status." Sola went first. With a flick of her wrist, she transferred her personal stash into the shared base storage. A list populated on the screen. Sola's assets. Tier 1 pneumatic harpoon rifle, durability, 42%. Standard medical kit X2. Refined diesel fuel X gallons. Bottled water 1L X3. Assorted ammunition spear bolts X6. I blinked at the screen, tapping the water icon. 3 liters. You've been riding around in a heavy iron tugboat robbing newbies, and you only have 3 bottles of water. I was robbing newbies because I only have 3 bottles, Sola snapped back, her pride stinging. Fresh water is the hardest bottleneck in the open waters. I had a Tier 1 condenser mounted on the roof, but a raider squad shot it to hell 2 days ago. That's why I fell back to the tutorial barrier. I was hunting for an easy mark with a full canteen. That made perfect sense. She wasn't just a pirate, she was desperate. I opened my personal inventory and dumped my own assets into the pool, pulling the final unit of water I'd saved from my Day 1 reward chest. Kalen's assets. Fish meat X11, 22 pounds. Barracuda scales X12. Serrated bones X3. Tier 1 lumen node. Bottled water 1L X1. Sola's eyes widened slightly as she looked at the food count. 11 units, you're holding over 20 pounds of clean protein. I haven't seen a stockpile like that in weeks. It'll keep us from starving during the storm, I said, and my bottle brings us up to exactly 4 liters, but you can't eat your way out of dehydration. No, you can't, Sola agreed grimly. She pulled up the local trade house interface. The text scrolled by in a blur of greed. WTS 1L bottled water 50 iron scrap. WTS basic desalination blueprint 1 tier 2 weapon. I closed the window with a sharp flick. That's a death trap. We don't have the scrap to pay those prices, and even if we did, nobody is going to honor a trade right before a Category 5 storm. Which means we need a localized solution, Sola said. She pointed to the newly expanded sonar map, a cluster of shallower reefs about 5 miles north. That area is littered with supplies-at-sea crates from the initial drop pods. They're high risk because they're usually guarded by whatever has moved into the shallows, but they're our best chance at finding an intact filtration unit or stockpiled rations. I looked at the massive hazard-orange A-frame crane at the stern, then back at Sola. We have the sub now, I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. If those crates are on the seafloor, we don't have to wait for them to float up. We can go down and rip them open ourselves. I spent that night reading the chat again, but the tone had shifted. The panic was real now. A post from a user named SaltDog88 was pinned to the top of the regional feed. The storm isn't a weather event, it's a cull. I shut the screen off. I didn't need to hear that right now. After a restless night's sleep, I joined Sola on the bridge. The command console of the Vanguard hummed with new life. I was still getting used to the fact that our boat didn't look like a floating tetanus trap anymore. The Tier 2 upgrade hadn't just reinforced the hull, it had completely overhauled our sensory array. We have a localized pulse, Sola announced, her fingers flying across the digital sonar projection. The old tugboat could only scan a half-mile radius. This deep-sea array is pushing 3 miles out and it's crystal clear. 3 distinct blips materialized on the holographic map, hovering over a shallow reef system to the north. A 4th blip pulsed right beside them, significantly larger and denser than the others. 3 standard supplies-at-sea drop signatures, Sola announced, and 1 high-density mass. That's either a high-tier drop pod or a really fat whale that swallowed a Buick. We didn't hesitate. We anchored the Vanguard above the reef and climbed into the 2-person submersible. The interior was tight, smelling of ozone, fresh grease, and a lingering hint of my own nervous sweat. Sola took the pilot's yoke, sealing the reinforced glass canopy. With a mechanical lurch that left my stomach up on the deck, the massive A-frame crane hoisted us off the Vanguard and lowered us into the churning gray water. The descent was smooth, assuming you enjoy being lowered into a dark abyss in a metal coffin on a string. The sub's exterior floodlights cut through the murk, illuminating a vibrant, jagged coral shelf at 60 feet down. There, I pointed. Resting in the sandy basin between two coral pillars were three standard bronze supply crates, heavily dented but intact. Using the sub's heavy-duty manipulator arms, Sola effortlessly clamped onto the metal handles and deposited them into the sub's external cargo basket. "That was too easy," Sola muttered, panning the floodlights toward a dark cavern in the reef. "Where is the dense one?" The light caught a reflection. Deep inside the coral overhang sat the gleaming, metallic shell of a high-density drop pod, but it wasn't alone. Two massive, dark shapes detached from the shadows. They were razor-gilled groupers, territorial predators the size of motorcycles, with thick, armored scales and jaws built for crushing shells. "Great, we'd found the neighborhood watch." "Brace yourself," Sola warned. She slammed the thrusters forward. The first grouper charged the sub, slamming its bony head against our reinforced canopy. The glass held, but the impact rattled my teeth so hard I tasted copper. Sola didn't back down. She expertly piloted the sub, bringing the right manipulator arm up and clamping the heavy hydraulic pincers directly around the fish's midsection. With a sickening crunch that made me wince, the pressure cracked its spine. The second grouper darted in, aiming for the sub's exposed external wiring. "Open the top hatch lock," I yelled, grabbing Sola's harpoon. Sola depressurized the upper airlock just enough for me to thrust the barrel of her pneumatic harpoon into the water. Ice-cold seawater instantly sprayed into my face. I fired completely blind. The spear bolt drove clean through the second grouper's gill plate, pinning it to the sandy floor. "Take that, Sushi." Combat resolved. Razor-gilled grouper X2 eliminated. Item acquired, fish meat X12. Item acquired, armored scales X8. Item acquired, heavy bone spikes X4. With the Guardians dead, Sola maneuvered the sub into the cavern, gently securing the dense drop pod in the heavy pincers. 20 minutes later, we were back on the rain-slicked deck of the Vanguard, cracking open our hull. The interface processed the physical crates, breaking them down into digital loot. Bronze crate yield. Bottled water 1L X4. Iron scrap X45. Synthetic canvas X5. Adhesive resin X2. I tossed 2 of the water bottles to Sola. She cracked one open immediately, downing half of it in seconds. "That buys us 2 days of hydration," she gasped, wiping her mouth. "Now pop the high-density crate." I placed my hand on the smooth, metallic surface of the drop pod. The system recognized my authorization, and the crate dissolved into a shower of white and silver light. High-density crate yield. Blueprint Tier 1 desalination condenser. Blueprint Tier 2 submersible weapon mount. Copper wiring X15. Basic mechanical components X10. I stared at the glowing blue schematic hovering in my vision. The Tier 1 desalination condenser. It was the exact solution we needed to permanently solve our water crisis. "Sola," I said, a grin breaking across my face. We spent the next 24 hours frantically building the desalination condenser and preparing the ship. The Vanguard groaned as it crested a rolling, blood-red swell. We were 2 days into the Crimson Gale's countdown, and the weather was no longer just an omen, it was a tangible, physical force. The sky had deepened from a bruised red to a violent, pulsating violet black. "Kalen, get to the bridge," Sola yelled over the roar of the wind. I scrambled up the steel ladder to the helm. Sola was locked into the pilot's seat, her knuckles white as she fought the rudder. The radar screen, now powered by the industrial core, was a chaotic mess of high-density sonar interference. But one signal cut through the static like a sharp blade. It was an automated distress signal, a low-frequency pulse. "SOS signal detected. Coordinates 3.4 miles northwest. Vessel status, critical hull breach. Remaining survivors, 12. "It's a container ship," Sola shouted, her eyes darting between the rogue waves and the radar. They're dead in the water. If they don't get bilge pumps running in the next hour, the storm will swamp them. I looked at the fuel gauge. We were burning through diesel at an alarming rate just to keep the Vanguard steady. We can't tow them, Sola, not in this sea, and we can't get close enough to transfer pumps without smashing our own hull. I know that, she snapped. But if we leave them, they're part of that 54,000-player culling. I looked at the chat. The screen was scrolling so fast it was illegible. User 8812, it's tearing the containers right off the deck. Saravi, where is the Vanguard? I see their beacon on the map. Kalen, help us. I froze. They knew where we were. They were watching our beacon. They have industrial-grade filters on board, Sola said, her voice dropping, devoid of emotion. The exact components we need to actually build that Tier 1 desalination blueprint we found. If we help them, we risk everything. If we take those parts, we secure our water supply for the entire gale. You want to rob them? I asked, my voice rising. I want to survive, she retorted, pointing at the radar. The gale is a cull, Kalen. Do you want to be the one who kills 12 people or the one who lets 12 people die? I stared at the blinking SOS signal. I had come here to save people, but the open waters were systematically stripping away my ability to be a hero. I gripped the railing, my fingers tightening against the cold steel. The storm was screaming outside, and for the first time I couldn't tell which was louder, the wind or the sound of 12 people waiting for a rescue that was becoming an execution. Turn the boat, Sola, I said, my voice cold. We're going to them. Your funeral, rookie, she muttered, but she spun the wheel hard to port, punching the throttle. The Vanguard cut through the swelling, blood-red waves as we approached the distress beacon. Looming out of the violent ocean was a rusted behemoth of a container ship. Faded white lettering on the peeling hull read of 12B312. It was listing heavily to starboard, dead in the water. Sola didn't charge in blindly. She cut the engines 100 yards out, letting us drift in the turbulent trough of a wave. She grabbed the weatherproof loudhailer. Vessel of 12B312, her voice boomed over the howling wind. We read your SOS. Send a single representative over on a life raft. Do not bring weapons or we will sink you. A few agonizing minutes passed before a small motorized raft dropped from the side of the container ship. A single man in a heavy yellow slicker steered it toward us, fighting the choppy surf. As he bumped against the Vanguard's reinforced hull, he looked up, his face a mask of shivering desperation. Our bilge pumps are dead, he yelled over the storm. We're taking on water. Please, you have to help us. I leaned over the railing, feeling a pang of sympathy, but as I reached a hand down to help him aboard, the man's eyes shifted. The desperation vanished, replaced by a cold, calculated glint. His right hand darted inside his slicker. He didn't even get the metal clear of his jacket before Sola moved. With terrifying speed, she kicked the heavy steel railing, launching herself forward. Her boot connected squarely with his jaw. The man crumpled backward into the raft, a crude zip gun clattering onto the deck of our ship. Thwack. A heavy crossbow bolt slammed into the iron plating inches from my head. I dropped to the deck, my heart hammering against my ribs. Looking up, I saw movement along the rusted railing of the container ship. Half a dozen raiders were taking aim with spear guns and crossbows. It was a trap. Sola crouched beside me, a wild, unapologetic grin breaking across her face as she unslung her Tier 1 pneumatic harpoon rifle. Well, look at that, she yelled over the wind. It's not piracy if they shoot first. Welcome to the moral high ground, rookie. Cover me, I shouted. Sola popped up, her rifle thumping loudly as she pinned a raider to the container ship's bulkhead. While they scrambled for cover, I timed the rise of the next massive swell. As the Vanguard crested the wave, I lunged, hurling my rusted rebar grappling hook at the lower railing of 12B312. The metal bit hard. I swung across the gap, boots slamming into the rusted hull, and hauled myself over the railing into the shadowy belly of the ship. I was a boardwalk tourist 3 days ago.